The Army capstone concept was intended to do two things primarily. First, to identify the trends in the future operating environment so that the subsequent documentation that we prepare conceptually would address those trends. And second, it was intended to nest into the capstone concept, the capstone concept for joint operations, such that we would understand where we have to blend our capabilities into other services capabilities to provide a military instrument of power for the nation. So that's the Army capstone concept, and it's literally the capstone of our conceptual work. And all this looks in a time frame approximately 2016 to 2028. The Army operating concept is intended to describe how the Army has to fight in that environment, and therefore what capabilities it needs in the 6 warfighting functions to deliver that capability for the Army in order to address the future operating environment. So the Army capstone, the Army operating concept is really that document which describes how we believe we must fight and provide capabilities by a warfighting function in the future. I'd also add that from the Army operating concept derives 6 warfighting functional concepts. So we have a fires concept under development that describes how fires will contribute to that fight in the operating concept, and a maneuver concept, and a sustainment concept, a mission command concept, and so forth. There's two, let's call it, there's several, but there are two ideas I'd like to highlight in the Army operating concept. And one is the idea that our Army has to be able to perform 2 fundamental responsibilities in the operating environment. The first, these are not listed in any particular order, we have to be able to provide both wide area security, or security over wide areas. You know, this doesn't have to become a semantic drill, but security over wide areas. And we have to be able to maneuver, and we describe it in the operating concept as combined arms maneuver. Let me make a distinction between the two. Wide area security is generally that set of missions that sets the conditions for the kind of things we find ourselves doing most prominently today in the operating environment. That is to say, counterinsurgency operation, counter-terror operations, even humanitarian relief, which has a measure of requirement for security, economic development, governance, interaction with international and multinational partners. The conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan are at their most basic challenges of establishing wide area security, fundamentally to capitalize on gains made through the other responsibility. The other responsibility is combined arms maneuver. Combined arms maneuver is the act of gaining through literally maneuvering in a combined arms environment, gaining the initiative and accomplishing gains that then must be consolidated through the wide area security mission. Now let me elaborate a bit on that, because the combined arms could be misinterpreted as exclusively military arms. We actually, as part of both the Army capstone concept and as part of the Army operating concept, recognize, concede, and elaborate on the fact that the definition of combined arms is much expanded in this century and is intended to include all the agencies of government, potentially non-governmental organizations, international organizations, anyone who can bring some capability to the accomplishment of the mission would certainly be included under a rather expansive definition of combined arms maneuver. But the important point to take away from this is that those 2 fundamental responsibilities, the ability to maneuver, to gain the initiative, to seize and maintain the initiative, and then the ability to consolidate those gains through wide area security, are a much more precise way of describing what we have to deliver for the nation, and breaks the paradigm in some ways of this unhelpful distinction between COIN and MCL. And I have some thoughts about why that distinction is less important today. You know, we have been involved in a debate, a rather significant debate inside the Army and out about whether we should optimize for a particular form of warfare. You can tell I'm even uncomfortable with the phrase. But also against a particular threat. So, as the argument goes, the Army must optimize its capabilities for either counterinsurgency conflict or for major combat operations. Frankly, I consider it to be a rather empty and increasingly bankrupt argument in an environment where, as we've defined it in both the Army capstone concept and the Army operating concept, where the capabilities that heretofore were in the hands of almost exclusively nation states are now proliferate across the battle space, across the environment. So, hearkening to our own experiences of the last 9 years, but also to those of others around us, notably the Israelis in Lebanon in 2006, I think it's fair to say that we should expect in wherever we are employed, and whether we're employed in a maneuver environment or into a wide area security environment, we should expect that militias, non-state actors, potentially state actors, criminal organizations, will have military capabilities that are almost indistinguishable from each other. The IED is clearly an enduring threat on any battlefield in any mission, as to are some anti-tank capabilities, RPG-29. We're very close to a situation where our adversaries, regardless of what we call them, will have guided and precision rockets and missiles. So it becomes a blurred distinction in our view to suggest that two things: that to suggest that you can pick your particular conflict and form of war and remain in it, and secondly, it's that your adversary will somehow conform to your expectations about it. The capabilities, it's just a far more competitive security environment. And in that environment, we have to be able to perform both wide area security and combined arms maneuver. And one is not a lesser included mission of the other. They are both equally important. Well, I hope they're affected by the operating concept, or it's been kind of an intellectual drill, and we're committed not to allowing that to happen. In the first place, TRADOC's role for the Army is to ensure that all of these concepts are then form the basis against which, as I've already mentioned, the warfighting functional proponents will assess themselves. So if we establish the fact that we have to be able to perform both wide area security and combined arms maneuver, then the Fire Center, the Maneuver Center, Sustainment Center, Maneuver Support Center, Aviation, Intel, Signal have to assess their capabilities against those two broad responsibilities. So that drives a lot of work in terms of organizational design, manning, on the one hand. And then on the other hand, in terms of training and leader development, we would expect this conceptual work to inform the way we train at home station and, of course, and notably at the combat training centers. So that when we have a training event, when we start to have time as an Army to do more than just prepare for the next deployment, and we're approaching that point, then we would begin to design scenarios, training exercises to ensure that we could assess ourselves against the ability to do both wide area security and combined arms maneuver. And then I would say in the area of leader development, this will inform us a great deal about what we have to expect of our leaders in the future. So, for example, we know intuitively that because in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan we've decentralized operations, we know that we've placed more capability, more responsibility, and more authority in the hands of increasingly junior leaders. So I often say that there are battalion commanders in Afghanistan and Iraq who have more capability than I had as a division commander in Baghdad in 2003. So we've made incredible adaptations at the tactical edge. We haven't fundamentally changed our leader development model to account for the fact that we're pushing all this responsibility to the edge. So this concept now begins to allow us to consider the key attributes that exist in leader attributes that reside in FM 622, leader attributes that reside in our Army leader development strategy. And I suspect, in fact, we intend to change, to revise, to review and revise those attributes. That in turn should inform the way we conduct our leader development instruction in the institutional schoolhouse, but also within tactical units. It should likely change the way we evaluate our officers, non-commissioned officers, warrant officers, and individual soldiers. I expect that at some point in the near future, this would result in a revision of this entire effort, would result in a revision of the officer evaluation report, because we think the attributes are different. Some clearly endure integrity. You know, we're not going to discount integrity and toss it on the ash heap of history. But adaptability, for example, may be an attribute for this operating environment and this operating concept that we value more. And then we have to find ways to measure it. We have to find ways to evaluate it. We have to reward it in our promotion and selection. We have to introduce it into our training exercises. So I'd expect that training exercises would have a component of uncertainty and surprise built into the exercise so that we can assess our leaders' ability to react to adversity and to uncertainty. So what I would suggest to you is that this operating concept, if it does what we need it to do, will cause us to see ourselves against those two broad responsibilities and against the increasingly complex, uncertain, and competitive environment, and then make adjustments across the DOTM-LPF dimensions, you know, from doctrine to organizational design to training, leader development. And none of this will happen overnight. I mean, I'm not suggesting that we publish the document and the Army turns 180 degrees and counter marches, because it doesn't have to. We're doing quite well, thank you. But we have to continue to adapt, and this is the way we're trying to encourage and drive institutional adaptation.